I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I want to join all the other previous speakers in thanking and congratulating the organizers for this very conference. I have organized conferences myself many times and workshops, and I know this is a very tough conditions for organizing such an international conference, and I really appreciate that you made it. And I'm very happy to join you today. As we all know, this very year 2020 is very different and very special to us, and I will try to reflect in my presentations on some of the changes we going through right now, not only from an environmental perspective, but also from an economic perspective and a societal perspective, because I really believe that the current crisis will have an impact on decision making, especially when we talk about investment decisions, and that's one of the areas I have worked in the last few years on climate and energies, with some focus on the finance sector. And talking about changes, I have to say at the beginning that not only things have changed, but my professional status has changed just recently too. So I have worked as an independent consultant on climate and energy politics for 13 years right now, and before that for many NGOs. I just recently joined the staff of the Austrian Vice Chancellor as his advisor. But this presentation, I want to say, is in my old function, which is, so to say, my final act in this role, and I'm glad I made it here. So I'm going to start the presentation. I hope that can be seen in the right mode. Yeah. Please give me a sign if something is not working. So to have some kind of structure and content, what I'm going to talk about, I think we really going through a disruptive area right now. 2020 as a year of change. We see some dramatic shifts, on the one hand by the pandemic, but also by the climate developments and developments in the energy sector. I will talk about the way of anticipating future developments and possible risks, and talk about hopes and expectations. As mentioned before, some see nuclear energy as part of the solution to the problems we face right now, and project some of the assumptions for the future. And I will show some analysis on that, how that worked in the past, and why I'm skeptic for these future projections right now. I will talk about the recovery programs we see right now on EU level, but especially on national level, and how climate and energy will play a role in that, and if nuclear energy is playing a role here, and what might be criteria for these recovery programs we see right now. That's one of the fields I work right now here in Austria, and have some final conclusions and try to serve some food for further discussions. And I'm really happy that some of the great experts on nuclear energy will then have their presentations. I have to say I'm not a specific expert on nuclear energy, but try to give some different perspectives on this technology. So to start, not with an environmental energy issue, I'm talking about the pandemic, because I really think it's shaping the discussion right now on political level. That is the economic situation, and we all know that the economic situation we are in right now is very specific. We have enormous decline of GDP in globally, but in nearly all regions, with some differences regionally. Here you see on the chart the decline in the second quarter of this year, with like Austria having 13.3% minus of GDP, Czech Republic minus 10.7%. So this is a really dramatic situation right now. It's getting better a bit, but still it's very clear that through the whole year 2020 we'll have a big minus with some consequences on economy, but also of course on the employment situation, but also on energy markets and on climate related issues. And I think for the political arena, that is, of course, a clear priority right now. And which measures we set right now will be decisive for many, many years. We also have a change in energy demand. This is a provisional analysis by the International Energy Agency, where we see how outstanding the situation of this year is, with a minus of about 6% of primary energy demand in 2020 so far. I think that will be a realistic number for the whole year at the end. And if you have a historic look back, we see that this really hasn't been here for a very long time, for more than 70 years. Even the financial crisis did not have such an impact on energy demand, and then on energy prices and on the energy markets too. This is the same projection for different energy sources, where we see that oil demand is going down significantly, but also coal demand, and we see that there is a minus on nuclear energy too, and some plus on renewables. This has of course to do with the different applications which were affected by the crisis. Having a look at flights, at the transport sector, which affects of course the oil industries. We had in spring a very short period of negative prices on oil markets, so really very outstanding situation. And we see on these examples that the thinking of very linear scenarios of business as usual, which is affected by many aspects right now, has got an additional perspective, which is by the pandemic. If we have a look at the possible effects on CO2 emissions this year by the crisis, we see that we'll have a minus this year. The question, of course, is how we will get out of this crisis. Do we have a pathway which is now going more into climate neutral or low carbon technologies? Is there a kind of a rebound effect if now, for example, the standards are going down because it's just about economic growth and some of the environmental matters don't count that much anymore, then we might see a negative effect in terms that CO2 emissions will rise next year significantly. So the way how we get out of this situation is absolutely crucial. And there is a lot of analysis by economic institutes on how the stimulus programs and the recovery programs can be designed to get really an impact on climate change and on GHG emissions. For example, New Climate Economy has done an analysis showing that if we do it in a good way, we can avoid 0.3% degrees Celsius by 2050. So that would have a real impact. On the other hand, we see that this year, though emissions are falling, climate change has not stopped. We see that in many heat waves, wood fires, tornadoes, and in this chart, you see the air temperatures anomaly for the last year. With some regional differences, you see that Europe has higher temperatures right now. And I think for investment and all political decision making, it's very important to integrate the climate change that we'll see right now, but we'll see in the next years, which cannot be avoided to some extent, integrated in our way how we project the future. And the energy markets are very affected by climate change itself. So it's like an interdependence in terms of that energy has an impact on climate, but climate has also an impact on energy. I think that we'll hear about it later on and in the next presentations too. So the term turning point 2020 is not just a new term due to the COVID-19 crisis and the pandemic, but it was raised by many scientists some years ago, which said that this must be the year we have the peak of GHG emissions, and then they have to be reduced significantly. And what we see in this chart is the different pathways to get within the limits of 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. And what is important in this chart is that it's not only about a certain year in which emissions we have in 2030 or 40, but it's really about the cumulative emissions. So it's not just the number, how much do we have to reduce to keep the temperature limits, but also what is the cumulative amount of GHG emissions. This is very important for if we talk about options and opportunities and costs, opportunity costs when we think about different energy technologies, because it's not just about how much emissions do we reduce, but when do we reduce it? Because it's clear the earlier we reduce the emissions, the more time we win later on. The later we are, the more we have to do a shock therapy to our planet. As I mentioned before, scenarios are important in decision making, and I will talk about the energy scenarios later on. But let me start with a scenario on risk assessment. I have screened the publications at the World Economic Forum, which is annually doing a risk assessment by stakeholders with a questionnaire where stakeholders from economy, the political arena, from civil society get asked, okay, what do you think is the most likely and has the most impact of risks for our economy and for our society? And we see that the climate aspects have gone more and more important in the last few years. I will go to the next chart because then we can see the terms. And I was curious if a pandemic, for example, was seen as a risk in the last few years. And we, on the left-hand side, you see spread of infectious diseases, which was seen as pretty impactful, but not very likely. And the last few years, all the reports didn't really identify a pandemic as a systemic risk to our economy and our society, which is interesting in my opinion, because from risk research, we know that there is a difference between the perception of risks and the real risks we have in life. And the pandemic was not on this list. It was mentioned by some stakeholders, and for example, Bill Gates was one of the warning voices on that. But it was not really something placed in our society. And I think that we see that there can be such surprising effects and surprising events which changes everything. And there are, so to say, invisible risks. And I think that talking about nuclear energy, this way of assessing risks and what kind of risks do we really are conscious about and which are real, that might change the debate again, because of course we know on nuclear energy, when we have a disaster like Fukushima, then there is a big debate and the risk is getting really, there is a higher awareness. But when there is no such significant event, is out of debate, but that doesn't mean that there is no risk here. So I think that the way of thinking risks will change. Some of the trends in energy markets and on energy technologies, I would just go through that very quickly, because of course that has to do with the way of investment decisions right now too. We see disruption on technological level too. For example, the dramatic cost reduction on renewable energy, especially on solar power, but also in the segment of electric vehicles. many industries are changing. There is the term of sector coupling getting more and more important, which means that electricity, the heating sector, and also transport get more and more integrated in intelligent systems. Storage is one of the big issues where we see a lot of technological process right now and cost reduction. And the question is if the conventional scenarios we face right now are really integrated this transformational process in their anticipation of the future. And I don't think I do a spoiler when I say I don't think so that they do really integrate that. Decarbonization is, of course, the big issue on many levels for all industries, on all political levels. Electrification will be one aspect, but of course not the only one. Yes, decentralization is one of the key trends based on renewable energy, which is not just providing energy supply, but really changing the system in terms of flexibility. Flexibility is required. Demand side management will be required. So the instruments we have and the institutions we have will have, which are very much in the old system pattern, will have to change based on these technological and structural changes. Digitalization and flexibility is a key term too. I think that the COVID-19 pandemic will give a boost on digitalization and on new technologies here. We see that in most of the recovery programs that beside climate-related aspects, digitalization is one of the key elements. And that will part of this transformational change too. Democratization is also important. The civil society will play a key element in this transformation of energy markets. Community power and energy initiatives, like it is stated by the European Commissions, will play a bigger role in this concept. For example, in Austria, just think about the renewable energy law, which will focus on community and community energy initiatives a lot. And divest, invest, which addresses the aspects of financial markets. We've seen in the last 2 years that there is a growing awareness in financial markets on fossil energy, but not only. Sustainability plays a bigger role, and I have some charts on that later on. So there are some aspects with the pandemic coming on. We see there are a big recovery and investment programs right now. We see that the term resilience is having a kind of comeback with the debate on globalization and more independence, especially when it comes to critical infrastructure and covering the basic needs. We have seen that there are some supply chain weaknesses in our economic systems. This is right now reflected on different levels. Of course, the question of flexibility, are we able to react to disruptive events? The social net, how it is designed and managed to really overcome such a crisis. And there is a debate hopefully going on about values, about the change of values, what is really important in our life. I mean, we're talking right now in a situation where the Czech Republic is in a kind of state of emergency. In Austria, we have, of course, a lot of restrictions too. So the question, what is important, what is needed, what are social norms when you talk about transport, for example? We see this video conference is a good example that things changes. And the way we perceive risks and crisis, the hope is that prevention will get more attention in decision making. So I defined a kind of key aspects and the kind of framework which you might use for decision making. One is, does a measure and investment have a positive effect on economy? Does it create jobs in terms of especially regional and local jobs? We of course know that the unemployment rate is rising. I'm aware that the Czech Republic has a very low unemployment rate compared to the other European countries, but of course it has risen too. So the question is, where do we get jobs and what kind of qualification can we provide? Of course, is a good investment profitable? Is it cost effective? Does it contribute to resilience? We're talking about supply chain and globalization. Does it contribute to climate change, or does it reduce GHG emissions, which is of course a crucial one? Talking about then lock-in effects. Are we doing investments and building infrastructure which will have lock-in effects in terms of having higher dependency on CO2 emissions in the next decades? If we think about energy and transport infrastructure, for example, does an investment create risks in terms of physical, financial, or economic risks, and how do we assess that? And are there environmental or social risks, which is of course very important in all energy aspects too. Talking about the recovery programs, you know that there has been side of the budget this Next Generation EU package with 50 billion euros, which is split in grants and loans. There was a debate if nuclear energy is part of that. With some elements on decommissioning, on safety standards. You know, that was a big discussion, especially in some of the EU countries. And of course, with some focus on climate projects here. I want to very briefly show the example of Austria, just to exemplify our approach. We have started an investment and recovery program in Austria, which is really focusing on climate protection and environment. So 1/3 of the additional budget is really going into climate protection, and another third has a positive impact on climate protection, which is integrated in the criteria. So we'll have decided additional budget of 2 billion euro for the next 2 years dedicated to climate friendly investments, with a 750 million euro fresh money for thermal renovations and for switching heat boilers to renewable heating systems. This measures alone will create and secure 40,000 jobs in the next 2 years. So we need to invest in qualification right now, but it's really regional and local jobs. We'll have additional money for renewable energy in the next 2 years, and additional money for innovative technologies, which was really climate friendly technologies, increased investments for public transport infrastructure and a better transport offer. And there's a model we called investment premium, which has started by beginning of September, which is 7% premium for all investments of businesses ranging from 5,000 to 50 million euro, with the focus and additional incentives if it goes into environmental measures like renewable energy, energy efficiency, waste management, etc. And there we have included climate damaging investments. So investments in fossil fuel infrastructure, for example. The demand for it is really high. Applications are, after 3 weeks, more than 1 billion euro, and it's still going on and increasing. So I think that might be one approach. How do we get out of this crisis? By investing in the right direction. And which one is the direction is something we are currently discussing, I think, in this conference too. So talking about the role of nuclear energy, I think it's important to always keep in mind that the share of nuclear energy in total final energy consumption is pretty low, with 2.2%. I mean, we very often debate about the approximately 10% we have in the electricity sector, which is pretty stable in the last few years, but we have to see the energy system as a whole and integrate heating and transport here. We see that we are very reliant on fossil fuels, but renewable energy have a larger share than nuclear energy. We see that if we talk about climate, then it's very clear that we need to get down with emissions. There are different scenarios and different approaches how to manage that. Here is one example of the International Agency, World Energy Outlook, with a share of energy efficiency and the reform of fossil fuel subsidies. Of course, a big role of renewable energies, and there are some other technologies where nuclear is integrated, for example, in the international energy, but also the sort of carbon capture, utilization and storage. But we have like other scenarios, for example, by Bloomberg New Energy Finance, we see a decrease of the nuclear share in the next years based on their assumption and on market analysis. I think it's very important in the question if nuclear can really provide something on fighting climate change, that the history shows us that the area of nuclear reactors where it was really really had on the rise was an area where we had really a rise of CO2 emissions too. I know that this is not just one by one, but there are many different aspects here. But we should keep it in mind that we, on the one hand, had kind of peak nuclear already, and the years before that were not really good in terms of GHG emissions. We see a dramatic shift right now, and I will show some of the charts of the World Nuclear Industry Status Report, which was mentioned by Stefan Kaineder before, which is of course always a great resource of information and a standard report. I think all of us is reading annually, and we see that there has been a significant shift last year with non-hydro renewable energy and electricity production overtaking nuclear after like 10 years of really growing, which is very much driven by wind and solar. And we see compared to other energy sources that wind and solar are really have taken the lead in the development. Of course, natural gas is growing too. There has been hopefully a shift on coal, which had a decrease in the last 2 years after rising in the 10 years and decades before, one has to say. And nuclear is not really playing a big role in that. It has had a slight decrease and a slight increase. It's pretty stable, and therefore the share is slightly going down, and oil doesn't play a significant role in power generation in terms of development. We see, and I will go through that just very briefly, that on capacity, power capacity, so it's not terawatt hours, but terawatt or gigawatt added, that solar power is really one of the key drivers here due to cost reduction and technology improvements. And of course, due to political regulation, which is in many regions supporting solar power. Yeah, we know from Michael Snyder's status report that we had already the kind of peak nuclear energy, and China is really driving the development in the last few years. If we would let out China, that we would have a significant decrease of nuclear energy. It's important to see that because we always got the message that nuclear is the future, but the development is going into another direction. Of course, the question of the age of the nuclear fleet is important here. When is the time where nuclear power plants get decommissioned? How long is their lifespan? How long will they play a role in the systems? With all the aspects of costs we'll have with that during operation, but of course, after that too. This is just really underlining the situation we had in the last few years on capacity added since 2000, and on the terawatt hours we see with big developments on wind and solar. One of the key drivers is the cost development. I think this is pretty well known too, and again, referring to the World Nuclear Industry Status Report, we have a massive decrease on solar PV with 89% in the last 10 years of costs. We have an increase on nuclear. We have some decrease on wind and some decrease, but a pretty stable situation on gas and combined gas power plants. So there is really, this is really a driver of the transformation we see right now. We have the annual analysis on the levelized cost of energy by Lazar, which is, I would say, just the confirmation of what we have seen before. Due to time, I will go to the next one. So if we take different elements before, like the cost development, the question of timing in carbon reduction and on carbon budgets, I think it's really very important to talk about opportunity costs, and inspired by Amory Lawrence, who gave a great presentation on that last year. It's really important with thinking budget, not only in target years, and we have three pillars: the carbon reduction, the costs, and of course the time. So in which time are we able to reduce GHG emissions? So those options which are costly or slow do avoid other less carbon intensive technologies that are cheaper or faster. So I think this timing question is very important, because we know that it has a very long period of time to really build new nuclear power plants to get them on track. So that is a crucial aspect. And there is, of course, a competition between technologies and other options like renewables, efficiency services with the different cost effects. As I mentioned before, but I think we'll hear about that later on, climate change poses physical risks to the nuclear fleet. We know that from analysis in the US, we know that from European numbers and examples like France last year, but also some other nuclear power plants like in Germany, Switzerland, and many other regions. There we talk about heat stress, water stress, hurricanes, floodings. So I think the whole sector is under stress right now, and being under stress means very often being that failure and mistakes are even more likely. I think we'll hear about that, the perspective of CO2 emissions in the life cycles. I mean, we know that there is a wide range of numbers going around by the different institutions from EIA and IEA. And I think it's just very important to get this myth that nuclear is per se low carbon, to get this away, because if you have a look at the whole life cycle, we know that there's a wide range and that emissions are higher than very often communicated in public. I want to show some slides on the job perspective. Thanks, I see 10 minutes. Thank you. Because I think, given the situation I described in the beginning, I think this opportunity costs, but also these opportunities we'll have where to invest, will be guided also by where do we create economic and employment impact. And we see that there is a big difference between different options and technologies, like if we do like efficiency and retrofitting, like the example I mentioned before. If we go into industry efficiency, if we have solar power improved, or have improvements in our new grids and existing grids, and we always see that nuclear is not really a job engine. And I think it's something we should keep in mind, especially not on short term, but also on long term. This is not a good option. While the numbers on renewable energy are growing globally, but of course in Europe too, we have about, based on numbers by IRENA and REN 21, approximately 11 million jobs in the sector. And the constant growth in the sector on global level. And if we can improve our instruments, I'm very optimistic that we'll have more and more jobs here. So I was talking about expectations and what is really very often we see in scenarios that nuclear energy plays a significant role. So what I did last year is having a look back at energy scenarios, and I will very quickly go through that based on previous analysis by Klaus Gufler for JASA, where he showed very, let's say, historic projections for nuclear energy, which was always not in line with reality, but really having higher expectations. And I did this for the World Energy Outlook, which I analyzed in the last few years by the EIA. And if you have a look on the real development on nuclear and what was projected in former forecasts and scenarios, we see like here on previous World Energy Outlooks that it was really, really higher than the real development was, and this was really going down year by year. So I did this with the annual World Energy Outlooks, and we see that it didn't really match the expectations. It's quite the same on coal-fired electricity. There is really a significant gap between what was expected 10 years ago and what is then the reality, and always every year projections are going down and coming closer to reality. On the other hand, on solar power, where we have seen the development before, there was the concept in the other way. It was totally underestimated based on business as usual scenarios and a complete underestimation of the technology and cost development. So this was every year going up, and still not matching what was the real number then. So right now we're close to this 120 gigawatt globally. And we see that the cost assumption, I mean, even in the World Energy Outlooks, nuclear is a very costly option compared to all the other technologies. I will just very briefly, why is that? So these scenarios are very much based on linear models, and there is a political perspective, of course, talking about the International Energy, saying that in the conventional scenarios, energy demand is always rising, and all of the energy sources will rise in current policy. So even coal is having a plus in these scenarios, and I think it's not realistic anymore. And there is, one has to say, really a critical reflection right now on that, and I'm very curious how the EIA will create their scenarios in the near future. This one is just one example that the question of what is important for the nuclear power sector is having some reflections by EIA, which is really in favor of nuclear power very often, but they see that they have a problem in mobilizing investments, that there is problems and competition with other technologies. There are a number of obstacles and challenges I think we are pretty aware of, but I think it's important, especially when we talk about costs, that there is a high gap between what was expected and what is the reality. And I don't think that's really integrated in the way of conventional thinking right now. It's very much a political thing if nuclear energy is pushed, and it's not really, nothing to do with market logics. Let me just very briefly, for the final few minutes, talk about financial markets, because that's an area I work with when we talk about divestment from different technologies and bring in finance markets closer to sustainability. We know that they have a lot of impact on investment decisions. That's why these scenarios are so important, in my opinion, because they affect investment decisions. And we see that on fossil energy, there is a growing number of institutions and investors saying that they don't want to contribute to climate change. That has risen in the last 2 years, driven by civil society initiatives, but also by the market, because there's the danger of stranded assets if you invest, for example, in coal power plants or in oil extraction with fossil reserves, which will not need it if we match the climate targets. In Austria, for example, just to have this one example again from Austria, we have some different finance strategies, and a lot of them are based on exclusion. So exclusion of criteria of sectors, and we see in Austria that nuclear power is one of the top exclusion criteria, which is of course very much driven by the consciousness and awareness in Austria about nuclear energy, but I think that will be more and more important on international level too. And that the whole process of sustainable finance, you know that there is a big discussion about nuclear energy in the EU taxonomy. That will be a big one. That's just one example, because we very often talk about public money, but we wanted to raise the awareness for private investments, and you have it not only if you are invested in a specific fund, but in your life insurance, in pension entitlements, in provision funds, employee provision funds. So that, I think something is going on in terms of people are more aware that they invest in something by their private money. So let's get back to the kind of framework I tried to outline in the beginning, and I'm looking forward to discussion if you think, and if we all think, that nuclear is a good option. But if I go through this list and raise this question, is there a positive effect on economy, on creating jobs? I'm very skeptic that nuclear energy really can provide something compared to other options and technologies. We know that profitability, I mean, without any really subsidy, there is no chance on the market for this technology. The cost effectiveness is really low in terms to other compared to other options. Is it really contributing to more resilience, knowing that there is resource scarcity also on nuclear energy, which is a big issue, which is, I think, underestimated very often. The contribution to climate change can be really doubted, especially when we talk about other options technologically and investment-like. Are there any lock-in effects? So does a region or country make it dependent, not only concerning carbon, but also in their independence from resources? What are the risks? I think it's very clear that nuclear energy is a very risky technology. There are physical risks, but also economic risks. And I think we get more and more aware about the risks we are not debating all the time, and there are social risks. I think it's very important to also raise the question of the social situation when we talk about exploitation of uranium, etc. So I think that, to put this very general, there are really better options in the transformation of the energy systems, and very good reasons to go for other options. Yeah, I will keep it here due to time, and I'm really looking forward to all the other inputs and discussions. And so thank you for your attention, and yeah.
Děkuji za první příspěvek dnešní konference od nezávislého energetického konzultanta z Vídně, pana Georga Günsberga, na téma možná role jaderné energetiky v boji s klimatickou krizí. Připomínám, že pokud máte jakékoliv dotazy, které se týkají právě toho, kdy můžeme odpovědět jak v debatě, nebo teď po příspěvku jednotlivých panelistů, tak pište tyto dotazy do sekce Q&A Q&A. Pokud máte jakékoliv technické problémy nebo technické dotazy, pište normálně do chatu. A teď prosím jednu z otázek, které přišly na pana Georga Günsberga a položím ji tedy já. Souhlasíte, pane Günsbergu, s tím, že do nákladů obnovitelných zdrojů je třeba započítávat náklady na akumulaci těchto zdrojů?
Yeah, I mean, the comparison is also on the one hand, because this question comes pretty often. I'm sorry, I just have to skip the translator. Yeah, I mean, we are talking about costs in the whole life cycle. So it's a really one-on-one technology comparison, talking about levelized costs. I mean, there is a debate on levelized cost of energy and renewables too, with different methodologies. But I think that the technology improvement really made the case that there is no doubt about the costs during the whole life cycle and the return on investment you get by the different technologies, being wind and solar power.